Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's open lecture in the series of open lectures organised under the auspices of the MA Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred. And tonight I'm delighted to be able to welcome Lucy Wyatt. Lucy is a distinguished researcher and writer, author of, excuse me if I refer to the title here, Approaching Chaos, Could an Ancient Archetype Save 21st Century Civilisation? A book that I could recommend to anyone. So thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, Simon. Well, good evening and thank you all for coming. Psychedelics, Cities and a Question of Origins. I think it is fair to say that after the end of the last ice age, we generally assume that the first cities appeared as an inevitable result of changes in farming about 7,000 years ago. But what if that isn't so? What if the whole concept of civilization didn't evolve out of farming, but emerged sui generis, without precedent as it were? What if cities were actually the result of shamanic practices of a secretive priesthood who could access a basic blueprint, and that these priests used certain psychedelic substances as part of their shamanic practices? This talk will propose that it is time for this unacknowledged urban shamanism to come out of the jungle and be recognised in its true context as the possible stimulus for the origins of our own modern, sophisticated way of life, and time for psychedelics to be seen as a useful part of civilization instead of demonised as they are at present. Now, during the course of this talk, I'd also like to challenge 3 seemingly unrelated modern myths, appropriate given that this is an open lecture, part of the MA on myths. The first of these myths is the one I've just mentioned, the one that farming led to changes in cities. And ask anybody in the street, Clapham Omnibus, wherever you ask them, how did cities come about? And I expect the stock answer that you'll get will be something about communities exchanging surplus agricultural produce and growing into bigger settlements, towns, marketplaces, and cities, and so forth. But while this is a commonly held view and widely accepted, it is an unexamined view, as I hope to show. The second myth is less obvious, as it concerns alchemy, and the general view that alchemy is arcane, obscure, and largely irrelevant to modern times. What I want to do to present to you tonight is an alternative interpretation that may change your perspective, because while alchemy can be difficult to understand, it isn't nonsense. In fact, alchemy is highly relevant to the whole subject of civilization, and I will explain more about that later. And the third myth is more of a philosophical one, to do with how we see the march of history, the teleological myth of progress. And what I'm referring to here is a blind belief in progress, that life just gets better and better, with the result that we believe ourselves to be the most advanced, more sophisticated than any previous civilization, who are ipso facto backward and primitive. My reason for mentioning this is because, in my opinion, our belief in the inevitability of progress has coloured our view of the past and potentially blocked us from not only gaining insight into the origin of cities, but also the role that psychedelics may have played. In other words, our post-Enlightenment, highly rational scientific way of seeing the world may have brought us many material benefits, but it has made it more difficult for us to access the past, both in terms of understanding and reconnecting. It has created a barrier that we can overcome if we adopt a different way of thinking. And once we have a better understanding of the past, we can even realise that ancient techniques, such as alchemy, for example, are still available to us. Now, before I go into more depth, let me first define my terms. What do I mean by civilization? This is where we usually start, with Greeks and Romans. And this is where many stop. With all due respect to Professor Versluis and David Feidler, that we heard talk earlier this summer, we credit Greeks and Romans with the civilizing influences of sanitation, legal structures, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and so on. Life as lived in cities, that's what I mean by civilization. And it doesn't take much genius to work out, however, that the Romans, for example, learnt much of what they knew about civilization from the people who were already on the Tiber. around 700 BC. When the Latin speakers rocked up, these people were already there. They were the Etruscans. They were the ones who taught the Romans how to live in cities and even built their early temples for them. But where did they come from? Geneticist Steve Jones has identified genetic links with Phoenicians, who had close links with Egyptians. And what is clear is that all of these people, Etruscans, Phoenicians, Egyptians, have much in common with the cities of the Indus Valley. And possibly Egypt, and certainly Phoenicians, and definitely Egypt, go back to at least 3100 BC. The much older cities of Sumer in southern Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia, date back to 5500 BC, and a hole in the ground. Now this hole in the ground measured about 12 foot by 15 foot, not much bigger than some people's bedrooms. This is the earliest layer of temple at Eridu, which dates to about 5500 BC. Now it is true that Mesopotamian cities were not the earliest settlements. We can go back further in time. We can go to Megar in the Indus Valley, which is 7000. We can go to Turkey, Çatalhöyük in southern Turkey, not to mention Göbekli Tepe, which is even older. Çatalhöyük was very well laid out, had beautiful storerooms in the centre. Göbekli Tepe had the extraordinary carvings. But none of these are settlements, are cities, let alone towns. They don't develop, they don't go anywhere, and they don't share the attributes of a city. Because what is remarkable from 5500 BC onwards is that there is a consensus that these are ancient cities and they are recognisable as such. And it is also possible to suggest that they all originate from the same template, the same archetype, because they share so many common principles. So when I'm talking about a city, how am I defining it? What are these attributes? I've created a colour wheel to help you understand this. It includes everything that a civilised city needs. And if we focus in on one aspect in more detail, on government, and look at how some of these principles applied to those early cities, none of these cities grew in a random organic fashion. As far as I can tell, there were three basic designs of urban layout: quartering, gridiron, and circular. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, for example, refers to the division of the city of Uruk into square miles with different zones, different functions for temple, for orchards, clay pits, and so on. Other cities like Akhetaten in Egypt and Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley had more of a gridiron pattern. So one key characteristic of a city is a pre-planned layout. Now for the planning of layouts and for the accuracy of construction of temples or whatever it is essential to have surveying, setting out. And for the ancient Egyptians, this was the role of Seshet or Sefet. She's the female counterpart of the god Thoth, the mistress of measure. She can be recognised by this seven-pointed petal thing on her head, which is believed to represent an ancient astronomical sighting device, because they used to lay these things out at night, so they would align this on a particular astronomical point. Now, whatever the project, a domestic palace, a temple, aqueduct, straightness was also consistently another characteristic. The use of the plumb bob is widespread. The Epic of Gilgamesh again refers to the great walls surrounding the city of Uruk being as straight as an architect's string. And you can see examples of the plumb bob in museums in Luxor, in Egypt, in Delhi, where the Indus Valley stuff is. Well, fundamental to ancient architecture was also sacred geometry, using the square roots of whole numbers and other irrational ratio familiar to us in the West as the golden section, phi, or the Fibonacci series. And this use of the golden section and straightness were achieved regardless of the size of the individual blocks, which could weigh several hundreds of tons. All the material used, whether bricks or stones, they were capable of extraordinary feats of engineering in the creation of their infrastructure, brought over huge distances, ignoring physical obstacles, feats that we cannot replicate today. And they applied the same standard of precision regardless of the purpose, whether it was a temple, whether it was a canal, irrigation channel, or an aqueduct. Indeed, the management of water, bringing fresh water in by aqueduct, was an essential part of city infrastructure. Temples nearly always had significant storage of water, and the sacred lake was a useful reservoir in times of drought. So with effective water management, cities could sustain life in relatively harsh environments. And equally important for them were their drainage systems for foul water. The urban drainage in the Indus Valley, for example, has been described as unparalleled in pre-classical times. And after all, efficient drainage and controlled sewage has to be the mark of being civilised. And in charge of all this was a ruler, quite possibly a shaman, to ensure that all happened as it should. And I shall return to this point and explain more about this shamanic ruler. First, I would like to go back to the earliest Sumerian cities around 5000 BC, and this idea that we have that cities developed out of changes in farming. Because, yes, it is true. It is true that there were momentous changes in agriculture that coincided with the appearance of these first cities. So if we go back to this point, I don't know how familiar you are all with this, but that's the yellow line is the Golden Crescent, and Uruk, and that's southern Iraq down there, Turkey, where it says Anatolia, and that's the Euphrates and the Tigris, the two great rivers. Now, what occurred around this time has possibly given rise to the confusion that cities emerged out of the changes in farming, and this something is called the secondary products revolution. And what this key development meant was that suddenly an auroch, which is the precursor of a cow, became a cow and could be used for milking and producing the secondary products of butter and cheese. The onager, they thought that was the precursor of the donkey, but it turned out it wasn't capable of being domesticated, so it stayed an onager. So not everything was domesticated. The tarpan, that's the wild horse. Yes, that was tamed and capable of being ridden. And the one that's almost most interesting is sheep, because before this date, before 5500 BC, sheep had coats like deer. They didn't produce wool. This is so significant, it's often overlooked. Now, we have convinced ourselves that it was these changes in animals that allowed the growth of cities. If you read the textbooks, that's what they'll tell you. Because the animals changed, cities could grow. But this shift to domestication was relatively instant. It wasn't evolutionary. And if it really was possible to domesticate wild animals simply by penning them up, why did that change not occur earlier? Because Neolithic man had been doing just that for thousands of years. And how come not only did animals change shape, all animal species become reduced in size when the domesticated variants arise, they also became usefully docile. There is, of course, the chance mutant gene explanation, and I should explain that part of my insight into all this is that I still do have a family farm, so I have had various animals on the farm. Now, this chance mutant gene explanation that somehow Stone Age man was able to spot that an auroch was carrying the gene to make a useful cow. How would Stone Age man, that was one of our cows from the farm, how would Stone Age man know what would make a useful cow? How did he have the benefit of hindsight? And how suspicious that the outcome was so convenient and so useful? In my view, it happened because of cities, not the other way round, and was deliberate. So is it reasonable to suggest, therefore, that there is a missing link between hunter-gatherers and Bronze Age city dwellers? Because the evidence suggests that the earliest Bronze Age farmers were not former hunter-gatherers who adapted to some kind of environmental change. Hunter-gatherers were not used to staying in one place. They followed the herds, even if they did pen them up for short periods. They were more used to killing than keeping stock alive, especially through the winter. It is an entirely different skill set becoming a livestock farmer. And the earliest farmers did not switch from hunting herds to herding herds. And what supports this view is that the earliest examples of Bronze Age farming that I've been able to find, and I've even looked in places like the Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan, which is one of the early examples of this kind of thing, these early patterns, they always involved a settled pattern first, based on pigs, before they changed to cattle and sheep. And pigs do not travel the distances of cattle and sheep, and so are indicative of a more static lifestyle. Moreover, the archaeological evidence reveals that the origin of a city is not a randomly organised marketplace. The first evidence of its existence is a shrine. And when I refer to shrine, what I'm talking about is a specially built chamber deep in the ground, such as the one found at Eridu. The site at Eridu is dating this one, it dates 2000 BC, and then there are 17 layers below that dating back much earlier. And this is what this is the sort of reconstruction of the city, it may have looked like. So the hole in the ground is relevant because it predates any building of the actual city. And this is what the place looks like today, an Iraqi war zone with a few soldiers wandering around. But returning to the ancient past, others such as Jacquetta Hawkes, the writer, have commented that the key group of people who are involved in cities from the start are not the farmers but the priests. So in order to shed more light on what may have been happening in Mesopotamia, I would like to focus on Egypt and extrapolate from what we can learn there. In particular, I propose that the Mesopotamian hole in the ground was created for shamanic journeying, and that the Egyptian equivalent of the Mesopotamian elite, the pharaohs, were quite probably shaman. Because how else did they know what they knew? And how did they succeed in keeping Egyptian civilization so amazingly consistent for nearly 4,000 years? Is it because they shared something in common with the shamans of indigenous people? Because pharaoh shamans were not necessarily fundamentally different to these people found in the jungle or on the steppes, who all experienced initiation, taught how to have out-of-body, near-death experiences, so that they could journey in spirit form on behalf of a person or a community to get answers. And during this initiatory process, spirits will dismember the shaman, strip the flesh from his bones, put him back together and revive him. The shaman is therefore someone who dies and is resurrected, and then learns how to travel, or astral plane, which could involve descending to the underworld, to the land of the dead, or ascending to heaven, place of the gods, or sometimes to a fixed point, such as a pole star. Common to all descriptions of shamanic activity are references to climbing the world tree, cosmic pillar, or some other form of axis mundi, using a sacred ladder, or stairways, or flight as a bird. And something that all shamans also share is the ability to fall into a trance and experience altered states of consciousness through the use of psychoactive substances. Someone whose work has given me insight to much of what I've been describing is that of Dr. Jeremy Narby, who I had the pleasure of hearing speak at Breaking Convention a few years ago. In 1985, as part of his PhD in anthropology from Stanford University, he travelled to the Peruvian Amazon in order to study a native community, the Kirisharu, who he thought of as primitive and backward. And in his groundbreaking book, Cosmic Serpent, he describes his experiences and how he actually soon changed his mind. They weren't primitive and backward as he thought, because it was while he was in the Amazon that he undertook a shamanic experience using the ayahuasca vine, in which a pair of enormous snakes communicated with him. What particularly struck Narby was the visual parallel between the image of the entwined snakes in the caduceus and that of the double helix of DNA. It's on the front cover of his book. He came to the fascinating conclusion that the parallel was more than visual, it was actual. Shamans, he concluded, were communicating at the level of molecular biology, of DNA itself. He thus discovered how native people learnt their use of often highly toxic medicinal plants, which would kill you before you had the chance to experiment with them, unless you knew what preparations to make. Native people also knew precisely which plants to choose out of 80,000 Amazonian plant species. And the means by which they knew this non-empirical knowledge, he was told and personally experienced, was through shamanism. Narby was also surprised to discover in the technical literature that the shape of the double helix of DNA is most often described as a ladder or a spiral staircase, which compares with these references worldwide made to climbing a ladder during shamanic trance. He also reviewed the many references in Western culture to twin snakes, and particularly to the classical concept of the caduceus and the image of Hermes. And here is Hermes with his pair of twin snakes, shown much as Narby describes them. And interestingly, this image of Hermes, he's shown with wings, which suggests flight or possible astral travel in the etheric realms. And what we also know about Hermes, or Mercury as he was known to the Romans, is that he links back to the ancient Egyptian god Thoth, who had many roles. He's the psychopon, the recorder of souls, the inventor of writing. Thoth also had many names, such as Jehuti, but Hermes wasn't an Egyptian name. So why did the Greeks call him Hermes? Is it because the Greeks heard him referred to as the Urmes, which could have meaning of as son of the foundation, and I'm spelling son S-O-N. In other words, son of the archetype of civilization, meaning foundation, and mesomos meaning son. For example, the Pharaoh Tutmosis is the son of Thoth. Now this word U-R, is fascinating, because in modern German it still has the meaning of ancient, original and archetypal. It may even well be at the root of the word for Pharaoh, which is a Greek word, again a Greek word. And given that the Pharaoh's destiny was to be initiated and become top shaman, the word Pharaoh could easily be a Greek corruption of the words relating to the place where that Pharaoh's initiation took place, happened. The Per-U, which has the meaning of house of foundation, Per meaning house. And this might have been at somewhere called Neken, or Hiranakopolis, which is its Greek name. It's a sort of mysterious fort which seemed to have no defensive purposes. Now what the Pharaoh prepared for here was a highly important, once-in-a-lifetime festival, which only happened every 40 years, and so it's sometimes referred to as the Pharaoh's Jubilee. The Egyptians called this festival the Heb-Sed Festival, and it involved the Osirian rites, a reenactment of the death of the god Osiris, cut to pieces by his brother Zeth, and his revival at the hands of his wife Isis, which sounds very much like a shamanic initiation. And where this Heb-Sed festival took place was in and around a pyramid. Most pharaohs had their own pyramids built for their Heb-Sed festivals, which is why there are so many pyramids in parts of Egypt. This is what remains of the Heb-Sed festival court at Saqqara. Now there were public aspects and secret aspects of the festival. Citizens came from all over Egypt, and the purpose of it was to rededicate the country to civilization, to acknowledge the sacred foundation of cities. The secret part, the Osirian rites, resulted in the pharaoh being buried alive for 3 days inside the pyramid. Now it's our cultural problem that we think of pyramids as linked with death and tombs. The Egyptian word for pyramid is mr, M-R, which has the idea of instrument for ascending, not a tomb. So when the pharaoh entered the pyramid for the secret part of the festival, he was going into the realm of Sokar, the deity Sokar. And Sokar is interesting because of what he represents. He had a more complicated association with death than just being dead. He was part of a triple manifestation of the gods Ptah, Sokar and Osiris. And these gods represented the triple powers of animation, incarnation and restoration, and were thus essential to Egyptian ideas of the soul being immortal and reincarnated in a living body. What the pharaoh did when he entered the pyramid is that he either lay down in a sarcophagus or on a special Heb-Sed festival bed. And these special beds are sometimes covered in gold leaf, and you can see Tutankhamun's Heb-Sed festival bed in the Cairo Museum, for example. And before doing this, the pharaoh participated in the Wapawet opening of the mouth ceremony. Now, was this mouth ceremony, was it done to stop him from swallowing his tongue during a trance? Because being in trance can sometimes be a bit like an epileptic fit. And what confirms my suspicions that this was all part of shamanic ritual are the pyramid or coffin texts, also found at Saqqara. These texts describe the soul's journey of the pharaoh while alive, a shamanic journey. The Egyptians themselves called these texts the Book of Coming Out by Day, not a reference to death. Dr. Jeremy Nadler, an Oxford academic, is one of the few who, in his book, Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts, is one of the few who has come to this conclusion, as he points out how these texts are full of the kind of language found among shaman all over the world. These pyramid texts frequently refer to the pharaoh taking on the form of a bird, flying up, or climbing a ladder. Chapter 20, for example, talks of the pharaoh rising into the sky like a mighty hawk. Another refers to a stairway to the sky, which is set up for me, that I may ascend on it to the sky. I ascend on the smoke of the great sensing. I fly up as a bird. Now, what the pharaoh was doing in the pyramid was engaging in alchemy, which I think we have completely misunderstood. We have failed to realize that the word alchemy probably originates from the Egyptian word chemi. And this word chemi means the imperishable northern stars. That is what I think alchemy actually means. The normal translation is black lands. That's the usual translation. But I think it's to do with these fixed stars, astral planing. And these pyramid texts make explicit reference to the pharaoh flying up in the form of a falcon to the imperishable northern stars, to the chemi. Now, once we make a connection with this shamanic interpretation of alchemy, everything else falls into place. Even the pharaoh's use of psychoactive substances starts to make sense as part of a process that relates to alchemy. Indeed, the pharaoh may well have used narcotics as a means of going into trance. The Egyptians were familiar with a variety of psychoactive substances, such as the blue lotus, which is known to have certain properties. But narcotics may not, however, have been the only substance consumed by the pharaoh. If we focus on this image of him with a blue lotus at the front of his head, what we notice on the top of his head is that he has an unusual cone shape. Now, this cone shape may well have been something called the solar bread. That's where it lies there. Now, was this also a means of going into trance? Here is another image of the solar bread, someone offering it on their hand. And the point at which the pharaoh consumes this bread is highly significant. During the Hebsed festival, he consumes it during something called the Hetep ritual meal. And this meal takes place before he goes into the pyramid. So what was the solar bread? It clearly had special properties. One pyramid text, which Jeremy Nadler calls an enigmatic food spell, is an utterance for the offering bread to fly up. Is that an indication of a shamanic substance, or should I say alchemical substance? And what might be the connection with alchemy? Could the solar bread have been monatomic gold, or something that the alchemists refer to as the philosopher's stone? Have we confused a substance with a process? We think alchemy is about the making of the stone, but perhaps that is only part of the whole out-of-body experience. We haven't necessarily understood the purpose of the stone, that maybe it has a fundamental role in creating altered states of consciousness, thus enabling shamanic astral travel. One curious connection that may help to shed some further light on this interpretation is the role of the cow goddess Hathor. She had many roles, mostly to do with nurturing. She sometimes lends her cow horns to the goddess Isis when she's tending the infant Horus. Hathor is also the one who nurtures the soul of the pharaoh on his journey. And she had other names, such as Nupta, Golden One. And if we go to her temple at Dendra on the Nile, you will find the hieroglyph for gold on its outside back wall. And it's also at Dendra that there are those strange light bulb looking reliefs down in the crypt, which may relate to electrical processes involved in purifying gold. And even more significantly, it's at her temple at Serabit el Khadim in the Sinai Peninsula, where in the 19th century the great Victorian archaeologist Flinders Petrie found vast quantities of mysterious white powder with no animal residue containing it. This was hidden under slabs in the floor. Was this powder that Flinders Petrie discovered the solar bread, i.e. the philosopher's stone? I'll leave that with you to think about. Now, whether I'm right, there is no denying that Egypt was able to stay so consistent for such a long time. It seemed to have all the right ingredients for successful civilization by using alchemy to stay on track. With its pantheon of deities, here we have the great god Osiris and his consort Isis holding the balance, and the pharaoh as top shaman, and Hathor, nurtured by Hathor, possibly using blue lotus and monatomic gold, solar bread to astral plane, keep it all going, watched over by Thoth, the writer, the recorder, so that Egyptians and the rest of the world could live in peace, in harmony. This is the goddess Mart. She has the feather of truth on her head. So this is the total archetype, civilization, the full thing. How could it possibly go wrong? And why did it go wrong? And why are we so ignorant about shamanism and its connection to civilization? In my view, it went wrong because a completely different ethnic group of people took over the known world. People that we know as the Indo-Europeans, and in particular, Greeks and Romans. These Greek and Latin-speaking tribes did not have alchemy in the sense of a shamanically accessed blueprint of cities as part of their cultural heritage. They came from originally much wilder, more hostile places where warfare was commonplace. So when the Latin speakers came upon the peaceful and civilized Etruscans on the Tiber, and the Greeks found the Minoans and other places on the mainland, they did not necessarily change their militaristic mindsets. So I think we should be wary of calling this the start of civilization. Rather than starting with Greeks and Romans, in my view, it ends with them. Because what the Greeks, and especially the Romans, managed to get hold of were the externalities of the archetype, the gifts of civilization, the benefits that others had created for them. Because by 700 BC, they were able to benefit from improved agriculture, the domestication of animals, organised arable production, and also systematic emphasis on caring for the individual body through the art of cooking. The link between food and medicine had been made by this point. Asclepius is one of the Greek gods who was very keen on combining food and well-being. Medicine had become more sophisticated, with many remedies being recorded and medical instruments that sometimes are not much different from those still in use today. Cooking was no longer nuts and berries from the hedgerows, but involved larger scale bakeries and breweries, as well as the import of spices. Now this had been going on for thousands of years before the Greeks and Romans knew about it. And this development of cuisine and the importance of trade, communication, all kinds of communication, trade, travel, education. People knew how to navigate by this point. The Phoenicians, for example, were legendary sailors. They knew the world was round. Geometry means earth measurement. But the bit that was missing was this bit, the priest-king relationship, the secret shamanic ritual part, how to access the secrets at the heart of civilization. Now, having said this, to some extent, there were some Greeks who were the exception. They weren't all like the Spartans. It is true that Greeks, and to some extent Celts, where they took up with Druids, knew about how to do some sort of journeying and some sort of getting out-of-body stuff. And the Greeks had places like Delphi and Eleusis, Delphi with its famous oracle, and Eleusis where extraordinary mass shamanic rituals involving mind-altering substances took place. And these were private rituals. Not anybody could go. The Emperor Nero was denied, for example. And although these places were important and their use lasted for a long time, they did not prevail. It was the might of Rome. This is the full extent, going right through into Turkey, all over North Africa. This is Rome at its height of its power. And these Romans were more interested in using their military power to persecute the carriers of ancient knowledge, those who may have used shamanic practices, including alchemists and druids. And it is thought one of the main reasons why the Romans may have invaded Britain was to come to Anglesey, to Mona on Anglesey, where the druids were, and destroy them. That was their motive. They could easily have left the Channel as their barrier and continued trading with Britain. They didn't need to come to Britain. And they also persecuted others, such as the Essenes, and particularly the Chaldean Magi, who were at the other end of the empire in Turkey. The Romans deliberately went to the middle of Turkey to destroy the Magi. They fought campaigns all the way there. And the Magi were living in the remnants of the Hittite Empire. And all of this happened long before they began persecuting Christians. Hundreds of years before they began persecuting Christians. And as Rome increased in power, Egypt declined. Now, curiously, the Romans did pay lip service to this aspect of civilization, based on the king-priest relationship. they had the role of this priest called the Rex Sacrorum. And so it's like a shadow of the king of the sacred, a sort of king priest. But he had no real power and was limited to duties concerning calendars. His lack of power and emasculated role serves to emphasize the superficial connection to the ancient archetype. He also practiced in a subordinate role to another priest, the Pontifex Maximus, a title that is more familiar to us in a later context, because it was this priest that morphed in the 4th century AD, with the Emperor Constantine's decision to adopt Christianity, into the all-powerful Pope and head of the Roman Catholic Church. And even today he's still called the Pontiff. And it was after the 4th century AD that the Romans had the means to invade people's minds and carry on with their persecutions, this time in the name of God. And they were able to successfully destroy what was left of Egypt with a massacre of the last priests on the island of Philae at the Temple of Isis. And these same religious fanatics, these Romano-Christian fanatics, went on to destroy the site of the Eleusinian Mysteries in Greece near Athens. And they burnt down the famous library at Alexandria, murdering Hypatia, the last priestess. And it is at this point that they symbolically and literally cut us off from the ancient past, because as a consequence, we lost all means of accessing Egyptian wisdom and knowledge through hieroglyphs. We could no longer read hieroglyphs. We couldn't understand them. And that was only rediscovered 1,500 years later, in the 19th century, by the Frenchman Champollion, who translated the Rosetta Stone. So in my view, we have been living in the shadow ever since, ignorant of what might have been the true origin of something we all take for granted, how we came to live in cities. So what happened to the archetype? Well, all was not lost. The secret techniques of how to access the knowledge did not entirely die out after Egypt collapsed. And I think they possibly went up the trade routes, appropriately enough, to the northern Euphrates, to a place called Haran. Not far from Mosul, actually, where there's an awful lot of activity. And this place, Haran, in this place, knowledge of the archetype was kept alive by alchemists and a people known as the Sabians. And these Sabians, they went on to influence Sufism and Islam through their guardianship of Egyptian wisdom contained in the Hermetica, the emerald tablet of the thrice great Hermes Trismegistus. And it is from this point onward that we see the blossoming of Islamic civilization as it incorporated the archetype, and it took advantage of the Sabians and their knowledge of the archetype, of mathematics, of medicine, of architecture. And this knowledge manifested in the creation of great cities like Baghdad and the widespread application of the concept, such as the use of sacred geometry, which can be seen, for example, in the Islamic Moorish influence on southern Spain, with its very appealing use of geometry. And for several centuries, the influence of the ancient archetype remained limited to Islam, in spite of the Moors being in Spain for hundreds of years. The archetype did not spread to other parts of Europe. It wasn't necessarily until the Knights Templar in the 12th century began to appear, after the First Crusade, when they went back to recapture Jerusalem from its Muslim captors. Only then did Western Europeans start to take an interest. Certain Burgundian nobles from northeast France may have learnt of the ancient archetype from contact with their Islamic counterparts, their Islamic opponents, and they may well have decided to create the order of the Knights Templar as a means of acquiring this ancient knowledge, because it is highly significant that the Templars led the Second Crusade to that same area, back to Haran. They actually went to a place just south of Haran, a place called Edessa. This is the Second Crusade, or Sanliufa, and this place is quite probably the Ur of the Chaldees. Now, was that because they knew Haran is also known as the city of Abraham, was where esoteric knowledge was to be found? It's just a curious coincidence otherwise. And when they returned to France, they were able to use what they had learnt in the construction of the stunning Gothic cathedrals, which rely on geometry, using square roots of whole numbers and something basic as a compass, for their integral structural strength. The geometry is absolutely essential in how they managed to create those incredible heights. Now, under the influence of Islam, this Gothic style of architecture spread throughout Europe. In England, for example, every church built around this time has an Islamic east window above the altar. But wider knowledge of the ancient archetype, however, remained limited. It remained suppressed. The Knights Templars wanted to protect the knowledge from the church. They had a motto: to will, to dare, to know, and keep silent. Because apart from geometry and building spectacular Gothic churches, the Knights Templar ultimately could not overcome the power of the church, and an unholy alliance between the Pope and the French king eventually destroyed them. Now, one man who had more success was Cosimo de' Medici. And in my opinion, it was his decision to have Marsilio Ficino translate the Hermetica, that body of ancient Egyptian wisdom, in the 15th century, that was the stimulus for the whole Renaissance movement. For a while the church was diminished. But when the church did try to reassert itself and resume its stranglehold on our intellectual development, it did it by burning Giordano Bruno at the stake in 1600 and condemning Galileo Galilei to die a heretic in 1642, all for knowing facts that we completely take for granted today. It wasn't until the 17th century that the tide really began to turn against the church, with the arrival of people like Sir Isaac Newton, born the same year that Galileo died. And significantly, Newton, often called the father of science, was a very active and secretive alchemist, who possibly used alchemy to make his discoveries of gravity and light. And this time, what was begun in the Renaissance had a greater impact, with Newton and others like him, such as Elias Ashmole and Sir Christopher Wren, architect of St Paul's Cathedral, and others. It gave rise to a wonderful flowering of civilization, many splendid examples of sacred geometry in so many buildings. And we can only speculate the extent to which alchemy, shamanic travel, played a part in this recovery of civilization. It was certainly important to Newton. A significant proportion of his personal library was dedicated to studies of alchemy. So to return to my original point about myths, that farming led to cities, I think it was more likely that cities led to farming. And if we keep our minds open to this alternative view of how cities came about, then so much else shifts for us in our interpretation of the ancient past. In particular, adopting a different view of alchemy, instead of seeing it as incomprehensible and nonsense, but as comprehensible and fundamental to civilization, once we've understood it as shamanic, then it changes the whole concept, it changes the whole game. We have only become ignorant of shamanism thanks to this history of persecution that I have outlined from Roman times onwards, and also because people like the Egyptians did keep things secret. They didn't really want everybody to know how they went about things. As a result, we have relegated shamanism to the margins, to the distant steppes, to the deepest jungle, where it remains in universities today, in ethnography, in anthropology. It isn't discussed in mainstream discussions about civilization or culture, or Western culture. And we remain deeply afraid of psychedelics because they have the power to unlock our untamed creative forces and shadow sides. Little do we realize the critical role they once played in gifting us all that is beautiful, sophisticated, useful, and harmonious. And finally, the last myth, the teleological myth of progress. It should be clear by now that I believe this myth has been particularly damaging for us. History shows that we are more than capable of going backwards, as it were. The change from Bronze Age to Iron Age was not a step forwards. There's much that we can learn from the ancient past, particularly if we adopt a more humble attitude and recognise that we are not the most advanced people that ever walked this earth. Then we might stand a chance of recovering the ancient original archetype, the Ur concept. Because we have a choice. We can either continue with our Iron Age disrespect, or we can reconnect. And they knew it was all interconnected. Revealing the hidden origin of cities shows that psychedelics and alchemy are our connection to a higher order of civilization than we currently experience. It has been done before and can be done again. Thank you.